I never believed in superstitions. I've always been the type who prefers rational explanations for anything that most people would call supernatural. So when I moved to this small town surrounded by forests, chuckling internally at the local stories and myths, I thought it was all just folklore created to scare children. It was such a tiny town that it barely appeared on the map, but the job offer was too good to refuse, and I needed a fresh start. Far from everything, the tranquility of the place attracted me like a refuge. Almost a new beginning. My house was on the last street before the town gave way to the forest. It was an old but well-kept building, with large windows and a vast garden, albeit a bit wild. At first glance, it seemed perfect. It was the kind of house that conveyed a sense of stability, something I really needed in my life at that moment. During the first few days, everything went exactly as I expected. The people were friendly, the neighborhood was quiet, and the nature around provided an atmosphere of peace. It was one afternoon, while I was watering the plants in the garden, that I first heard about the legend. The neighbor next door, an elderly woman named Martha, was standing at the gate watching me in silence. When I noticed her presence, I jumped a little, not out of fear, but because she seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, silent like a shadow. "You must be the new resident," she said with a friendly smile. "Do you need anything?" I thanked her, saying everything was fine. We chatted a bit about trivialities until she suddenly turned her gaze to the edge of the forest and asked, "Have you heard about the man who never moves?" I laughed politely, thinking it was some sort of local joke. "No, I haven't heard of him," I replied. That was when Martha began to tell the tale. According to her, there was a figure in town, a man who appeared standing still in random places, always in the same position, facing the houses, almost like a statue. They said that if you saw him and stared for too long, he would see you back, and from that moment on, he would start to follow you, slowly. No one knew who he was or where he came from, only that he never moved, at least not where they could see him, but he always ended up closer. As she spoke, I noticed that the friendly smile on her face had vanished. There was something in her tone that made the temperature drop a few degrees. "Of course, it's just stories," she said, trying to ease the tension. "But be careful. Sometimes it's better not to look at certain things." I laughed again, thinking it was all a big nonsense. After that conversation, I went back inside and didn't think about it anymore. I didn't believe in legends, and my life was too busy to waste time on superstitions. But at night, lying in bed, those words began to creep back into my mind, involuntarily. I don't know why, but I was troubled by the way she described the man. Never moving, but always closer. That image kept popping up in my thoughts. Days passed without incident, but one night, something changed. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a strange noise outside. I opened the curtains and looked out the window, expecting to see maybe an animal or the wind rustling the branches of the trees. But that wasn't it. Standing in the shadow of a tree at the edge of the street, I saw a man. He was completely still, as if he were part of the environment, his clothes almost blending in with the shadows around. I watched for a few minutes, waiting for him to move, but he didn't. I tried to convince myself it was just someone waiting for something, maybe a neighbor out for a walk, but something felt wrong. The way he stood there, almost rigid, like a poorly positioned statue in the landscape, filled me with discomfort. A part of my mind screamed to look away, but another, more stubborn part, urged me to keep watching. I wanted to understand what I was seeing. I wanted to see if he would move. Minutes passed. He didn't budge, no matter how long I waited. My breathing became heavy, and I forced myself to close the curtains. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept imagining that man standing there in the darkness. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a passerby, someone strange but harmless. Yet something inside me, something primal, told me I should be worried. The next day, I looked to the spot where the man had been, but no one was there. During the day, everything seemed normal again. I went back to my routines, but a growing sense of unease lingered. And at night, when I looked out the window, there he was again, exactly in the same spot. This time, I stayed a little longer, watching for any sign of movement, something to indicate that he wasn't just a ghostly shadow. Nothing. As the days rolled on, this nightly appearance became a constant. Every time I looked out the window at night, he was there, standing still. The same posture, the same place. I began to avoid looking, but it was impossible not to feel his presence. It was as if he knew that I knew he was there. I tried to ignore it, but every time night fell, a part of me wanted to check, to confirm he was there, as if it were a cycle I couldn't escape. As time passed, the small strange occurrences began. Objects I knew I'd left in one place were found in another. Small sounds echoed through the house at night, as if someone were walking around the rooms. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, perhaps due to the tension I was feeling because of the man. But it was real, and it worsened with each night. Eventually, I told Martha what was happening, hoping she would laugh and say it was just my imagination. But she didn't laugh. On the contrary, her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, she looked scared. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked in a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. Something inside resisted confirming. Martha didn't press me, but the expression on her face said it all. She knew. That night, the feeling of discomfort grew. I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that shouldn't be there, objects that seemed to move on their own, and of course the man, always there, motionless, but each time, closer. After that conversation with Martha, everything escalated. The feeling that something was off transformed into an unsettling certainty that grew with each night. I tried every possible way to shake off what she had suggested, to ignore the irrational fear slithering in the depths of my mind. But it was impossible. The man, or whatever that was, kept appearing, and each time I looked, he was closer. He was no longer just a distant, motionless figure. He was in my street, close enough for me to distinguish some details of his dark clothes and his shadowy, indistinct face, always in shadows, as if the streetlight avoided touching him. I knew I should stop looking. I knew this obsession was consuming me, that my mind was playing tricks on me, transforming the ordinary into something sinister. But it was like trying to resist the impulse to scratch a wound. Every time I passed by the window at night, my eyes were drawn to him, as if they wanted to confirm the presence of that thing, to see if he had moved or if he had gone away. And he never did. Then, things inside the house started to move. At first, small objects that could easily be explained away by my own distraction. A book I could have sworn I had left on the nightstand was now on the sofa. The key I always hung by the door appeared on the kitchen counter. Little things I could, on a normal day, simply ignore. But with the rising tension, each of these occurrences felt like a reminder that something was deeply wrong. I could no longer relax at home. I was always listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Creaks in the floor, as if someone were walking through the house when I was alone. The hinges of doors that seemed to open or close subtly, as if an invisible draft was pushing them. I began to lock every door in the house, checking each one before going to bed. But that didn't bring any comfort. The discomfort was constant, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders and neck, leaving me tense every moment, even during the day. However, it was one morning that my unease transformed into something deeper. I had left a coffee cup on the kitchen table before going for a quick walk around the neighborhood. When I returned, something was different. The house felt strangely cold, despite the warmth outside, and I immediately noticed that the cup I had left on the table was no longer there. I searched the kitchen, irritated with myself as if I was forgetting things again, but the cup was nowhere to be found. That's when I saw it. It was by the living room window, facing outward, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. The strange thing was that there were no coffee stains, as if the object had been moved with meticulous care. I looked out at the street through the window, and my heart leaped when I saw him. The man was there, closer than ever, no longer in the shadows of the trees, but now standing on the sidewalk, right in front of my house. This time I couldn't look away immediately. Something in the air seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very world around me was frozen in that moment. My whole body screamed for me to step away from the window, but my feet felt glued to the ground. There was something about him, something insidious, something that felt like it was slowly unraveling my sanity, like a thread being gradually pulled apart. His immobility was what disturbed me the most. Even there, so close, he showed no sign of life. He was a presence, a form, but not something human. I quickly shut the curtains, my heart racing uncontrollably. I sat on the sofa, trying to regain control of my thoughts. I took a deep breath, repeating to myself that all of this was a figment of my imagination, a construct of my tired and stressed mind. But deep down, I knew that was a convenient lie. Something was very wrong, something I couldn't control or understand. As the days went by, I began to notice that this presence affected more than just my house. The people in the town seemed different. Maybe it was my growing paranoia, but I noticed some neighbors avoided looking me directly in the eye, and others, like Martha, seemed restless whenever they saw me. I wondered if they knew something, if they had seen the man too, but no one brought it up. I was completely alone in that torment. One night, something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep despite the anxiety consuming me, when I heard footsteps outside the house. The sound was soft, like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floor, but it was definitely there. My breath caught in my chest. I slowly got up, every muscle in my body tense, and walked to the window, feeling like I was about to commit an irreversible mistake. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek, expecting to see him on the street, standing still as always. But he wasn't on the street. He was in my garden. My blood ran cold the moment my eyes found him. He was there, among the plants I had tended to just days before, as motionless as ever, but now so close it felt unreal. The distance between us was minimal, and everything inside me screamed that I should run, close the door, call for help. But my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if he had some power over me, some control I couldn't understand or fight against. I stood there, frozen, staring at him, and for a second I had the impression that he was smiling. That was enough to break me free from the trance. I slammed the curtain shut and stepped away from the window, breathless. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to go, and even if I called someone, what would I say? There's a man in my garden who never moves. Who would believe that? Who could understand the absolute terror I was feeling at that moment? In the nights that followed, I locked all the windows and doors, afraid that he would come any closer. And each night, he drew nearer. I always saw him, motionless, but now always closer to the front door. The sound of footsteps inside the house continued, but now louder, more persistent, as if something were prowling the rooms. I began to sleep with the lights on, but that only made things worse. The shadows danced across the walls, creating shapes that my tormented mind interpreted as him. No matter what I did, the feeling that he was getting closer was inescapable. My sanity was hanging by a thread. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was a product of my imagination. Every day was a battle not to completely fall apart, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while inside, I felt like I was crumbling. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. The silence in the house was no longer a relief. It had become oppressive, a void filled with tension, where the smallest sound echoed like a scream. I began to realize that no matter what I did, the man would never disappear. He was there, always present, like an invisible shadow looming over my life. And the worst part, he was getting closer. I could no longer follow my routine. Work, daily tasks, even the simple interactions with the townsfolk had become superficial. I was absorbed, consumed by the idea that something was slowly and inexorably approaching me. I tried to rationalize, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but inside me, panic grew like a silent beast, devouring my sanity. I started avoiding going out at night, and even during the day, I felt uncomfortable, as if I were being watched from afar. My visits to the town became rare. I avoided Martha, and the other townspeople began to distance themselves as well. They noticed something was off with me, of course, but no one dared to ask. It's not like I could explain what was happening anyway. How do you explain that someone is being stalked by a motionless figure? No one would believe it. Not even I fully believed it. And that made everything even more terrifying. Nights were the worst. Now, he was always in the garden, standing in the same spot, close enough for me to see him clearly. His presence was a constant, like a stain on the world I couldn't ignore. I started locking all the windows and doors, checking each one several times before trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. When I finally managed to fall asleep, it was a light and fragmented sleep, always interrupted by noises, footsteps, creaking doors, distant whispers echoing through the walls of the house. The shadows inside the house began to take on a life of their own. I know it sounds crazy, but it was as if, in the absence of light, something else was moving in the corners of my vision, something I could never fully see, but that was there. The lights on no longer brought comfort. They only made the shadows seem even more restless, as if they were waiting for a moment of carelessness to pounce on me. It was on one particular night, after days of barely sleeping more than a few minutes, that I realized he was no longer in the garden. I went to the window, my heart racing, expecting to see him standing there, as usual, but he had disappeared. I looked around, searching for any clue, any explanation for the sudden absence. Had he finally left? Had all of this been an illusion? Maybe the constant terror was starting to wear down my mind. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Perhaps it was all about to end. I went back inside, trying to regain control of my thoughts. Maybe he never existed. Maybe it was just a manifestation of my own paranoia, a reflection of the fears I kept buried. I convinced myself of this for a few hours, staying up late, occupying my mind with trivial tasks, anything to divert my thoughts from everything that had happened in the last few days. But then, around 3 a.m, I woke up to a sound that froze my blood. It was the sound of the front door handle slowly turning. I lay still in bed, listening to the sound with a clarity that pierced the darkness of the room. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but the noise continued. Slowly I got out of bed, each movement accompanied by the low, sinister sound of metal shifting. I descended the stairs barefoot, each step creaking under the weight of tension. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the house was shrouded in a thick silence, as if the very air had frozen in time. Then I heard another sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a light breath. It came from outside, right next to the front door. I stood there, on the other side of the door, unable to move, listening to it. He was there, I knew it, and for the first time something inside me knew he wanted to enter. He wanted to come closer, in a way he had only hinted at until that moment. It was as if the time he had spent there, watching me from afar, had come to an end. Now he was ready to cross the boundary between us. I couldn't think clearly. My hands trembled, and the sound of breathing from the other side of the door seemed to grow louder with each passing second, as if it were getting closer. I took a step back, intending to run for the phone, but a sudden thought paralyzed me. What if he was already inside? What if the thing outside wasn't the real threat, but rather what I couldn't see, what I still hadn't noticed? The house was dark, and the shadows, as always, were there, waiting, watching. The thought hit me so hard that my legs almost gave way. I knew I needed to escape, but where to? No one would believe me. Running to Martha's house seemed insane. And besides, I was afraid to open the door, to give him the chance to come in for good, to cross the barrier that had kept him outside until then. So I did what seemed like the only reasonable option at that moment. I went back upstairs, locking myself in my room, breathing heavily, trying to think of something, anything that could protect me. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door, and remained there, motionless, as if my own immobility could hide me. But the truth was that he already knew I was there. He had always known. It wasn't a matter of seeing him or not. It was as if, from the very first moment I saw him, he knew everything about me. And now, he was ready to finish what he started. The following days passed like a fog. I avoided opening the curtains, tried to ignore the constant sound of footsteps throughout the house, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He was closing in on me. Sometimes when I looked at a shadow in the corner of the room, I felt as if something was there, lurking, just waiting for a false move. One night, while I was trying to distract myself with the TV, I heard a low noise coming from the basement. It was a sound I had never heard before, a kind of scratching, as if something were trying to get out of there. My thoughts raced, and part of me knew I should just let it go, lock the basement door, and never go down again. But another part, the same one that made me look at that man standing outside, urged me to find out what was happening. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs leading to the basement. The sound grew louder as I approached. I didn't know what I expected to find down there. Each step creaked like a scream in the silence. When I reached the last step, I illuminated the room with the flashlight, sweeping the beam of light across the space. At first, everything seemed normal. The stacked boxes, rusty tools left scattered along the old shelves. But then I saw it. On the farthest wall, where the flashlight stopped, there was a figure. A shadow that shouldn't be there. I knew the basement was empty, but that shadow had a human shape. It was him, or what was left of him. There were no visible details, just the motionless silhouette I would recognize anywhere. My breath caught in my chest, and before I could move, I heard a low voice, almost a whisper, echoing around me. A familiar, dark voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I am already here. I fled the basement, rushing up the stairs and locking the door with my breath hitching. Now I knew. He was not just outside, not just on the other side of the door. He was inside the house, inside my head, watching me from within, waiting for the right moment to... I can't say when everything started to feel inevitable. Maybe it was that night in the basement, or when I realized he was no longer just outside. It was as if, from the moment I first saw him, he had been lurking, waiting. Now there were no more doors or walls that could protect me. He was everywhere, a silent and unyielding presence, and the more I tried to ignore him, the deeper the terror rooted itself within me. I stopped trying to find answers. The fear consumed me to such an extent that any idea of escape or confrontation seemed futile. He was here. He always had been. And the worst part was knowing that no one around me seemed to notice. They went on with their normal lives while I sank deeper into madness. I began to keep the curtains closed all day, lights on, 24 hours a day. Even so, the shadows seemed to come alive. The shapes dancing on the walls were no longer simple reflections. They were creatures moving, contorting when I wasn't looking directly at them. I felt their constant gazes. I felt that at any moment, one of those shadows could become real. And although I knew there was no one else in the house, something inside me was sure I was never alone again. One dawn, I woke from a restless sleep to the sound of something dragging across the floor, right below me. It was in the downstairs. For a long time, I just lay there, motionless in bed, as if my stillness could keep him away. But the sound persisted, insistent, as if someone were dragging something heavy from one room to another. I took a deep breath, and in an irrational impulse, I got out of bed. Each step I took toward the stairs felt like a deeper plunge into something irreversible. I descended slowly, my breath heavy, with the flashlight in hand, illuminating every corner of the hallway. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, listening. The sound had ceased, but the house was wrapped in a disturbing silence, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I walked into the living room, sweeping the area with the beam of light. Nothing seemed out of place except for the rug, which was slightly wrinkled, as if someone had stepped on or dragged something there. I shouldn't have cared about a rug out of place, but that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It was then that I heard the front door open. My head instinctively turned to the sound. I had locked the door, I was sure of it, but the doorknob was slowly turning, and the door, with a creak that seemed to last an eternity, opened a crack, revealing the night outside. I took 2 steps back, my heart racing, feeling as if the air around me had become dense, oppressive. The flashlight trembled in my hands as I pointed it at the ajar door. The man was not there, or at least, I didn't see him immediately, but the sensation that he was close, so close, was suffocating. I knew he didn't need to be visible to be present. I tried to summon courage, walked to the door and closed it again, locking it with trembling hands. I returned to the center of the room, struggling to calm my breathing, but the sound of my heartbeat seemed to fill the space. And then, with a chill running up my spine, I realized something was different. A shadow larger than the others. Something or someone was standing behind me. The coldness in my spine was instantaneous. My body froze, unable to move, but I knew he was there, watching me, waiting for me to do what he wanted, to turn and face him. It was like being trapped between 2 worlds, absolute terror and the need to see, to confront, but I couldn't, not this time. He was too close now, almost inside me. So, somehow, I did the only thing my survival instinct allowed. I ran. I climbed the stairs, stumbling on the steps, my heart in my throat. I locked myself in the bedroom, breathing heavily, my back pressed against the door. Outside, the sound of footsteps began to echo, slow and methodical, as if he were exploring the house, one room at a time. He wasn't in a hurry. I stayed there for hours. With every noise, my body trembled, and the pressure in my chest intensified. Time seemed to become irrelevant. Minutes could have passed, or days, until finally, everything fell silent. But the silence, far from being a relief, was even more frightening. The fear didn't leave. It just became deeper, more intense. I was completely alone in that room, and at the same time, I knew I would never be alone again. It was that night that I decided I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. I couldn't just wait for him to come in, take everything, consume me. I needed to do something, anything. It was my last chance to resist. The next morning, with the little sanity I had left, I resolved to seek answers. I unearthed old books in the town library, asked residents who avoided touching the subject, but the answers I received were always vague. No one really knew what that man was, just that he had always been there. For some, he was a manifestation of fear itself. For others, an entity, a spirit, or perhaps something worse. He existed beyond conventional explanations. My search led me back to the house, to the basement, the place I had promised myself I wouldn't revisit. But I knew that the end of this story, somehow, was down there. That basement seemed to be the epicenter of it all. His presence had become rooted there, like an open scar on the fabric of reality. Whatever it was waiting for me. I descended again, flashlight in hand, trying to ignore the pulsating fear that seemed ready to swallow me with each step. The narrow walls of the basement felt more oppressive this time, as if they were closing in around me. At the back, the shadow I had seen before remained there, motionless. But now I knew what to do. I couldn't keep running. I moved forward, trying to control my breathing. When I got close enough, the flashlight illuminated something I hadn't noticed before. There was a mark on the floor, like a symbol, drawn in crooked and worn lines, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a figure I recognized, but its presence there was impossible to ignore. The shadow seemed anchored to that symbol, and it was from there that the man came, or perhaps where he was returning. The shadow appeared to writhe as I brought the light closer, and then, in a whisper, almost inaudible, he spoke. It was the same voice that had whispered in the basement days before, but now it was clearer, more present. It's time. I didn't know what that meant, but deep down, a part of me knew that my struggle was coming to an end. He was about to cross the final barrier, And this time, I wouldn't have anywhere to run. The basement began to feel tighter, the air thicker. I felt as if I were being drawn toward that symbol, as if it were a passage to something much worse. With one last flicker of courage, I ran back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. The sound of the lock echoed through the empty house, but it didn't bring any sense of safety. That night, as I sat on the floor of my room, exhausted and defeated, I knew he had finally entered. It didn't matter what I did anymore. He was already here.